Thanks, Joel. Thanks for that latest weather update. As we continue with the show, let's turn our attention now to another important matter happening. So this week, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana will table the national budget for a third time. A delicate task ahead with, of course, the formation of the Government of National Unity to appease. And also at a time where South Africans continue to feel the pinch with the rise in the cost of living due to various factors, both domestically and globally. Let's unpack this further. Annaline van der Poel, Chief Legal Officer at Debt Rescue South Africa, joins us for more. Annaline, good morning. Thank you for joining us on the SABC at this hour for such important discussions.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's start at the beginning, perhaps for this week. What are your expectations for this third edition? Now that the VAT is not available to finance and spending, we're balancing expenditure measures with lower tax revenues. That is quite a conundrum in itself. What impact does this dilemma have at hand for the Finance Minister ahead of the retabling of the budget?
A very difficult one, I must be honest. Obviously, from a consumer perspective, we're very thankful to not have this VAT ultimately, being put in front of us, because that would have been devastating. But looking at some of the other measures that they are planning on implementing or potentially implementing, we might be seeing new tax brackets, etc., which is obviously going to have a devastating impact on certain groupings of consumers. Again, then on their personal income tax, and then of course sin taxes we know are always going to be there. And it sounds like, that might be one area that they're really going to focus on. It's not an easy one. It's not an easy act for the minister, let's be honest. He's got very little area in which he can maneuver, especially to try and appease as many parties and still achieve the result that he's looking for.
Yeah, it's a tight squeeze. And obviously, as we edge closer to the 21st of May, this is all happening against the backdrop of some of the macroeconomic forecasts that's also, existing in the shifting geopolitical climate. Talk to us a little bit more about what we are experiencing on that front as well.
Well, obviously, we've seen quite a couple of very interesting things happening in the past few weeks. We know we've had some, firstly, instability when it comes to regional conflicts and we have ongoing wars. And then we had the trade, the tariff hikes that were happening and the effect that that's had on the world globally. And obviously, us being an emerging economy, it does tend to filter back down to us in some way or another. So it's had quite a bit of fluctuation on the global markets. The good thing is the rand seems to have, stabilized quite well. The oil price is still looking pretty good. So that bodes well for us at the moment. But I think, a lot of this, unfortunately, does hamper our own economic growth, because if there's international instability with an emerging economy, it does mean that if there's instability there, that we are growing at a much slower rate, we're more cautious. Investment into our country is a lot more cautious, and that doesn't bode well, unfortunately, for us and our growth outlook.
No, absolutely. And another, recent stat that has been thrown into the mix is the unemployment stats that have been released by Stats SA, with the unemployment rate now sitting at 32.9%. You've got provinces like Mpumalanga and the Eastern Cape just hovering under 50% of, the population who are now unemployed. The Northwest already having reached the 50% threshold. These are alarming stats. Beyond the gains that we have experienced, what does this also add to that bleak picture?
Oh, unfortunately, it's devastating. I mean, one would expect, especially in the first quarter of a year, usually you'd expect the businesses to perhaps scale down over the festive season, and then once the new year starts, that employment would increase. And unfortunately, we've seen a 1 percentage point increase up to 32.9%. I mean, that's almost a third of our working age group of South Africans who are not employed. So what that means in essence is that households are becoming more and more over indebted. They're unable to put food on the table because they have limited income, and they're having to unfortunately make use of the social grants. And when I say unfortunate, I mean that it's not enough to sustain living. It's a very small portion. So the focus really needs to be on creating an environment where we see job opportunities, we see growth in the economy, so that job opportunities can be created, whether it be through entrepreneurship, through businesses growing, thriving, and not having to reduce their workforce. So definitely very, very alarming when we see, the unemployment just staying at this incredibly high percentage.
Absolutely. And if you're even looking at some of the other dynamics that are set to happen for the rest of May, I mean, beyond questions about global inflation rising, there's also the interest rate announcement that's pending. That's happening around the 29th of May, if I stand to be corrected. And there are mixed expectations on that front. It's going to have an impact on consumers and investors. How does SARB balance that as well? What can we expect on that front if we're going to be playing with the imagined crystal ball?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It's a crystal ball at this point. We know the governor's stance has always been very conservative, and rightfully so. I mean, obviously, he has to factor in more than just inflation. Inflation is looking good. I mean, obviously, it's at the lowest it's been in a very, very long time. That bodes well for hope that we might see an interest rate reduction finally, because unfortunately we missed that opportunity in the last meeting. So, we have obviously seen that there's economists and specialists who are stating that it is possible. We might see 0.25, maybe even a 0.5. I mean, that we could be hopeful. But we know that the stance that the government takes is beyond just inflation. So he's got a lot on his plate again to weigh up, but along obviously with the whole MPC, in terms of what it is that their mandate is and what it is that they need to achieve, which is ultimately protecting our exchange rate and focusing on having that balance and keeping us in that situation.
And speaking of which, we obviously seen credit ratings agencies also, release their outlooks in South Africa. Talk to us a little bit more about what that picture paints in relation to SA Inc. at large.
Well, obviously, when we talk about credit ratings, it means, this is an indicator to investors into whether they should invest in a country and in which parts of the economy they can invest in, etc. So S&P have kept South Africa's debt rating at BB minus and BB for local currency with a positive outlook. So at least saying with a positive outlook, that does say something positive, if we can put it that way. But unfortunately, it's still not a great credit rating. And they're noting that the strengths are sitting in the country's financial systems and the institutional checks and balances, but weak growth, high debt, and fiscal deficit remain key constraints. So as long as we are sitting with this, we're not going to see that uptick that we require in economic growth, which is ultimately going to lead to job creation. So it's really fundamental that focus gets placed on that, and that we get our credit rating back to where it was 5-6 years ago, where it was investment grade, where countries want to, or other businesses want to invest in our country, and ultimately then alleviate this unemployment problem that we do have.
Speaking of the economic growth dilemma, creating jobs as well, and just looking at the reduced workforce as well. I mean, there's also a growing debt crisis in South Africa as a result. And so we're obviously looking at the means of survival. Obtaining finances through illegal means is a scenario that comes to the fore because you've got mashonisas or loan sharks, and there are concerns on that front. Obviously, with an income not enough to sustain, bills piling up, people are turning to alternative means. But there are dangers and obviously measures that need to be navigated on this front. Please help us unpack that a little bit more, the do's and don'ts.
Well, the unfortunate situation is, and the reality is that many consumers no longer qualify for credit from registered institutions. Therefore, and it could be because of, for example, they have a bad credit rating, they're already maxed out on their debt, and therefore a credit institution which is regulated by the NCR cannot, give them credit because they're already extended, and therefore it will constitute reckless credit. So therefore, these consumers are sitting with a situation where they have no alternative. They need to put food on the table, and they end up with loan sharks. Now, obviously, when we're referring to this terminology, what it means is these are unregistered lenders. The National Credit Act has very, very clear guidelines on when an individual or a business needs to be registered as a credit provider, and 99% of the time, these situations are actually people who should be registered and aren't. And the dangers that come with it is the fact that it's unregulated, meaning that the National Credit Regulator doesn't have jurisdiction over those kind of transactions, so they can't get involved when there's any anomalies happening with regards to the kind of interest rates that are being charged, whether they're legal or illegal. And this then becomes ultimately a criminal matter where, if, for example, the tactics they use to recover their payments are not at all bound by any form of legislation. So they can take your bank card, they can employ, tactics that place you in distress to make these payments. So, and of course, it's completely ungoverned in terms of the interest rates that they charge. In other words, that it's just worsening this debt spiral ultimately, whether it be formal debt or informal, unregulated and ultimately illegal forms of debt, that is placing them in a worse off position.
Annaline, thank you for joining us and for weighing in, of course, ahead of the budget that's set to be tabled on the 21st of May. Government really need to spending its money more efficiently, of course, meeting its constitutional obligations and stamping out corruption. But we'll leave it there. Annaline Poel this morning, Chief Legal Officer at Debt Rescue SA, weighing in this ahead of Budget 3.0, again set to be retabled on the 21st of May. It's global and domestic factors influencing the economy. What will the Finance Minister do? Let's leave that there. We'll be right back after this. We've got another exciting chat for Africa Month on the way. Stay tuned.